Uh, the good thing about having the second session after lunch is that if anyone needed a power nap, I'm expecting you're finished by now. So we are going to be discussing insecurity challenges in South Asia, and we've got a really good panel today. It's covering a lot of geography in South Asia, which is rare in these panels because it tends to be quite narrow. We are covering, of course, India. We have representation from Maldives, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. My panel today, I'll start from the far end. It's Mr. Jehan Perera, who's with the National Peace Council of Sri Lanka. Next to him, we have General Abdur Rashid, who's with the Institute of Conflict Law and Development Studies in Bangladesh. Then we have Mr. Mohamed Hameed, who's with the Maldivian Democracy Network, but has also spent a long time with the Maldivian police, working on counterterrorism, amongst other things. And finally, we've got General Syed Hasnain, the definitive Indian Army serviceman who spent almost 40 years in the service. And we've already heard very kind words about him in the last session. I'm going to try to make this very free-flowing and not a very Q&A style talk, because there's a lot to be said in a limited amount of time. But one thing that I can see in front of me from some of the notes that I've got is the use of tinderbox. South Asia as a tinderbox, right? Which we come across very regularly. And on that sort of broad-based analysis of it being a tinderbox, the concept of CVE, or countering violent extremism, is fairly new, I think, right? We are very used to counterterrorism as a term in South Asia, but CVE is a very new terminology. And we've heard people here who have made their reservations known on the term itself. So fighting narratives and as a viable strategy to fighting insurgencies or extremism. From your personal geographical perspective, so Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Maldives, India, all very different, have very different set of challenges. If I can start from the far end and not from this side this time. Mr. Perera, from a Sri Lankan perspective, what is CVE? Is it something that Sri Lanka associates with, or understands from its own sort of domestic challenges? Or is it something that is quite fresh and you still have to figure out according to the Sri Lankan context? There's a mic there, yeah.
Sri Lanka has experienced violence for most of its history, post-independence history, beginning in the 1970s. And there have been two types of violence that we have faced. One is class-based, ethnic, Marxist insurrection. We had two episodes of that in 1971, and then again in 1988. Well, large numbers of people lost their lives. The other type of extremism we have faced, violent extremism, is ethnic. And that led to a 3-decade-long civil war, where again, tens of thousands of people died. So extremism is still in our country. I think how do we approach it? There are two ways that we can approach it. Now, I come from an NGO background. And so we would look at the causes of extremism, of violent extremism. And we would see its roots as being in the issue of marginalization, discrimination, exclusion from power. And that has been most severely felt by the ethnic minorities, because there is a permanent asymmetry in a democratic society. Democracy based on periodic elections, based on majority ruling. What it has meant in Sri Lanka is a permanent ethnic majority ruling permanent ethnic minorities. And the permanent ethnic minorities feeling that they are being unfairly treated, that they don't have access to decision-making power, that others are deciding for them. So we in civil society have been always urging political reform, political solutions, power sharing. There is the other perspective, the perspective of the state. And the state sees the problem of extremism, violent extremism, as one that requires a security solution using the military. We had this particularly strongly in the case of the last government, which ended the ethnic war, the civil war, through purely military means. But we also have had a tradition of our governments trying to address both the class-based insurrection that began in 1970s, as well as the ethnic insurrection through political reform. And in fact, the government that we have at the present time is one that is trying very hard to politically reach a political accommodation with the ethnic minorities, but it is facing a lot of challenges because in an ethnic conflict, a country gets polarized. And what the minority wants, what the minority sees as their just rights, is seen by the majority population as being extremism. And if a government tries to move in the direction of satisfying the minority aspiration, the ethnic majority see it as weakness. And this is exploited in a democratic system by the opposition political parties. They use it to undermine the credibility of the government. So we are in this process at the present time. So as I said, we in civil society see dealing with extremism as requiring addressing the political roots of the problem, whereas the government tends to see it more from a security point of view, but our governments have also had the political reform agenda in mind.
Okay, I'll just pick on something that you said. You said talking about political accommodation after orchestrating a military, reaction. So Sri Lanka went for basically the option of completely decimating the opposition, right? There was no middle ground. So so how does that sort of factor in? How does political accommodation work after choosing that sort of, no consequential option of completely going after the adversary militarily? It seems quite natural that political accommodation is going to be difficult now, specifically. So how does this equation work at the moment?
Yeah, our government has come in under a lot of pressure from the international community as well to deal with what happened during the war, the last phase of the war, where the rebel group was decimated. And the ethnic minority, the minority population, which also suffered as a result of that military campaign, they also want the government to deal with what happened. And what they want would be accountability. Now, this is extremely difficult for the government, accountability. Accountability for war crimes. But from the ethnic majority's point of view, the end of the war was the best thing. Problem is over. From the minority's point of view, their loved ones were killed. And in some cases, very arbitrarily, in a way that could be called war crimes. So the government is really struggling on this one because it's very difficult to prosecute a winning army. The last government denied that such atrocities happened at all. The present one accepts that these may have happened, It has accepted a transitional justice process, but it is finding it very difficult to move ahead. But there is international pressure on the government to move ahead, and the government has promised to move ahead in terms of truth-seeking, reparations, institutional reform, and also accountability. But accountability is going to be a very big problem.
Right, and which is a major sort of issue to deal with anyway in these sort of circumstances. If I can just move the same question to General Rashid from a Bangladeshi perspective, which is, I think the Bangladesh issue of extremism in Bangladesh is much more sort of delicately poised than it was or it is in Sri Lanka. So General Rashid, from a Bangladeshi perspective, what is CVE? Does that ring a bell in strategizing, tackling extremism in Bangladesh?
First, I extend my thanks to ORF for inviting us and sharing the environment of the whole South Asia as a whole, and thereby sharing knowledge and will be benefited well to deal our problem. First, I must say that I can proudly say Bangladesh is a showcase to fight countering the violent extremism. Bangladesh, since its birth in 1971, first it actually came across with the leftist or the ISIM insurgency, and which has been dealt very nicely. And now that ISIM insurgency's actually existence is no more there, and thereafter we had faced the ethnic insurgency, which is in Chittagong Hill Tracts, one part of similar to Sri Lanka, but which has been more of a combination of hard approach and the soft power. Both are applied together, and government focused on political solution. And I think we must thank our neighbor India to have the to cooperate about having a political solution, and we had a peace treaty, and after that actually the problem has been minimized. And thereafter the latest one was the so-called IS problem, the Islamic terrorism, which the country basically is a Muslim country and Sunni Muslim. Of course, you had some discussion about Hanafi and Wahhabi Muslim, but Bangladesh is a Hanafi Muslim, the only advantage we had. But we had also suffered a lot. But question is that last year, it is globally known that in the Holy Artisan, the most elite area of Dhaka was attacked, and thereby about 20 foreigners were killed. And to save them, the police forces which acted very promptly faced a grenade attack, and there they suffered a huge amount of casualty. That is the largest casualty that the police suffered. And thereafter, the government also had two kind of blending approach, the soft power and the hard power, and it gave a success. Now it is sufficiently controlled. I say that main battle is the ideological battle, which had to be fought for a long time, and I think we are here today how to tackle those ideologies. And Bangladesh has actually tackled it very nicely. And what I would say that in the last year, Bangladesh hard power, just a small figure, about 32 police operations were conducted, where 85 active militants were killed. And thereafter, the organizations which have been active with their members, now we consider they do not have really the active militant members now. If there are active militant members, but they are very growing type, not a very well trained. So that's actually giving a little bit of peace in the country and has raised the safety level of the country much higher than last year. So that was our success. And all this combination, if we say city is only, it appears only you are using hard power. Term is very hard, and now in the strategies they have changed the terminology. Now they call it either CVE or PVE, which is a very soft one, so that it is a mixing of the approach that you take. not only causing casualty, also the counter narrative you create, you activate the civil societies, also the education ministries, religious ministries and others, combine them together, make a what is called a PV or city strategy and apply the all government power and the civilian power together. So that makes the difference, and Bangladesh has applied that difference very effectively. Now I would say that we are mostly concerned about the ideologies, and Bangladesh, the ideology that if we analyze, that we find certain special characteristics of the ideologies. And many have suggested that we have to create a counter narrative, and still with my lot of studies I have not found a suitable counter narrative in the global, in the world, which could take us to reach our objective. So automatically, there is a question, as he said, mentioned, that to fight CT or PV, whatever you call it, should we be approaching globally, or it is a country specific or locally? To my mind, it is a local battle is the best battle. So you have to clear it from the village to village and then the state, and then you approach the global. If we try to apply a global solution to every country, the same solution, I am sure that is not going to work. So Bangladesh is an unique example who has decided its own course and applied it, a blending of hard and a soft power, and which has actually given a very good dividend, and that is the main thing. And one I must make a mention that is there. The neighboring countries' relation and cooperation is very important about countering violent extremism. The Bangladesh and the India, you know, the largest boundary that they share, about 4,096 kilometers. So automatically, that's cross-border terrorism condition you have to stop by any means. But both the countries work together, and Bangladesh is thankful to its neighbor India for its cooperation in curbing the Bangladesh insurgency and extremism. So in that we had all the cooperation, and for which it was easier for Bangladesh to counter or reduce the impact of the terrorism. And that's why both the neighboring countries, all the neighboring countries, I would rather say, of the South Asia must exchange their ideas and share their experience, and also cooperate whatever they have the capacity. Because, you know, we have found that ideology, whatever we have found, is not locally originated. This is the first thing, that the violent extremism ideologies, none of the ideologies are locally originated. It is not the philosophy of the land, so it is always imported from outside. So thereby we see two things. The ideology has a higher mobility and higher connectivity. So if we like to tackle this ideology, this is very important. We have to kill its mobility and its severe its connectivity. Then a country might get out of it very quickly.
Right.
And Bangladesh is trying to do that. I'm sure hopefully it will be out of the total problem.
Right.
Thank you.
I think that's the ideology thing we'll come back to in much more detail as we go along. Right? The second point that was made was addressing these situations in a very hyper-local manner. While usually the concepts of these things are quite global in nature, but we'll get back to that. Just moving on very quickly to Mr. Hameed from Maldives. Now we've read a lot of things about extremism in Maldives, right? This very not with a lot of detail, but whatever you hear in news is what you get. You've been in the field in Maldives. What is the situation like at the moment, and how do these concepts of counterterrorism or counterviolence apply to an island nation, which is quite small in geographical nature, but yet it has produced a lot of cases of violent extremism? So just your thoughts very quickly on this issue, and we can move ahead.
Well, I first take this opportunity to thank ORF for inviting the organization which I represent here, the Maldivian Democracy Network. And I also happen to be someone who had spent 17 years in the police service, which is the National Police Service, and also did a stint.
Just close it. Yeah.
Did a stint as the lead for the counterterrorism department of Maldives Police Service. Maldives has been making headlines over the last few years to have spent or sent most foreign terrorist fighters to Syria, which our government denies, but foreign independent observers claim it to be somewhere in the region of about 200, but the government officially says it's 60, which again is very, not very helpful to our situation. From my experience, I think violent extremism has been a growing concern. I have been handling, even prior to the issue of IS emerging and Maldivians being reported to have gone to Syria, we have dealt with Maldivians who had affiliation with other terror outfits like the Al-Qaeda, Lashkar-e-Toiba, who had been to other conflict zones such as Pakistan, Afghanistan. I have personally dealt with these people, helped authorities repatriate them from Pakistan. Given all that, and knowing how dangerous these people are who had returned and who have been residing within our society for the last, let's say, 7-8 years, I very well understand the concerns that we have and the dangers which might pose, or the threats that poses to our nation's security as well as the region's security, which we are here to discuss today. Maldivian government, I think for understandable reasons, because Maldives very much rely on the tourism dollars. 30% attributes to tourism when we talk about the country's GDP. Because the image gets tarnished when Maldives is associated with terrorism, I think, which might be the main reason the government or the administration downplays the numbers, which is, again, not a very helpful situation. The government was forced to recognize the existence of this bigger problem. I think just about 1.5 years back, Maldives introduced or publicized its first ever state policy on countering terrorism and preventing violent extremism. And on the last year, it introduced a strategy to countering violent extremism. And I honestly think these are very cosmetic things which has no meaning from where I stand, from what I see, because I do not see a lot moving. I call these things cosmetic because many of you might have been reading in newspapers, democracy has been declining in the Maldives. We are reversing, to authoritarian rule. This has been happening since 2012, February events of 2012. And this has given a very good platform for the people who propagate extremist narrative in the country. Maldivian youth, which contributes which is around 44% of the population under the age of 35 years, are very susceptible to all this global extremist narrative, like Save Islam, West is against Islam, or very sympathetic towards the Kashmir conflict, very closely watching the Palestine-Israel conflict. So all this affects Maldivians, because we are a 100% Muslim nation, and Islam has been, we have been practicing Islam since 1153. So for the past 865 years, Maldives has been a Muslim country, Muslim nation. So for those reasons, these narratives affect Maldives, and there are people who are actually taking advantage of this vulnerable youth. And lately we have been seeing people, youngsters, who are already radicalized in a non-religious way, but radicals in terms of their perpetration of violence, gang criminality, or in criminal background and all that. I think it's very easy, again, to tap into these people or to reach out to these people and get them recruited into more violent extremist campaigns. So this is the current situation in the Maldives, and I hope that it gets better and there is some meaningful action taken against or to curb this issue of violent extremism or radicalism that is taking place at a very rapid pace. Okay, thank you.
I think some very interesting points made there, and we'll again I will get back to a more cohesive discussion over this. And just to finally come to General Hasnain now. Of course, you've spent so much time on the field, and when we are discussing counterterrorism or terrorism, Kashmir is always on the forefront of these situations. So, as a practitioner from the Indian Army, I'm sure you're more privy to what counterterrorism is, right? But equally important is these days specifically where internet is a huge mobilizer. You know, WhatsApp, we've seen how WhatsApp is used for both productive and non-productive uses. The whole idea of countering violent extremism, the CVE part, does it even fit anywhere in an Indian narrative, from your perspective at least?
Thank you. Can you hear me at the back? Thank you very much. Thank you, Arif, for inviting me here for this wonderful interaction on this panel. Much of South Asia is represented, but as you would notice, a very important state is not represented. That's Pakistan. And I intend to represent Pakistan too. So let me start by explaining you what is my understanding of violent extremism. You know, I think the best anecdotal way of explaining it is to look at a YouTube video in which you find a Pakistani terrorist who's been captured, a suicide bomber, who's been captured. And he's being interrogated. And he's asked. He says, the interrogator asks him that if you are going to detonate yourself somewhere here, all you are going to kill is fellow Muslims. So then what are you achieving? What is so great in your mission? So he says, no, these are not Muslims. None of these are Muslims. Muslims are only us, the ones who believe in my philosophy. And he justifies the use of violence to achieve his aims. Now, when you combine this ideology and combine the justification of violence to achieve that, that becomes violent extremism. Let me explain it to you in a slightly different context. There is nothing wrong in following a faith or a sub-faith in which is attempting to take you back to the 7th century AD and saying, you will follow the tenets of the faith as followed in 632 AD. Nothing wrong with it. As long as you don't force me to follow your faith. If you are telling me that I need to follow what you are saying, and you are going to use violence to change my mind, then sorry. I may have to use counter-violence to change your mind. You see, that is what violent extremism is. And you need to understand that that has to be countered. And there are ways and means of countering it. In India, in the Indian or South Asian narrative, what you have to understand is there are various reasons for why all this has happened. We cannot deny ourselves the fact that the Middle East and South Asia were two regions in which parallel tracks of movement of ideology took place. Both of them were essentially anti-colonial. It happened with the Muslim Brotherhood in the Middle East. And it happened with the Jamaat-e-Islami in the Indian subcontinent, almost simultaneously, 1928, 1941. And that's where it developed. And then I would disagree slightly with the Ambassador Manpreet Vohra. After that, it became contextual. There was a narrative, and then it became contextual. When we say contextual, it does not mean necessarily that that context becomes the driver, but it definitely becomes the trigger. It becomes a trigger. Movement after movement, if you see in the Middle East, lots and lots of dots in history have become triggers. The creation of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, etc., etc. In India, 1977 is a very important part of our history of the Indian subcontinent. That's the coming of Zia-ul Haq to power in Pakistan. And his choice of retribution against India for the creation of Bangladesh. And his methodology and strategy which he chose, that he would seek retribution not through the direct conventional war route, but by a war of 1,000 cuts. A war of 1,000 cuts which would exploit India's fault lines. And how would those fault lines be exploited? Through the use of violent extremism. Most people have forgotten this. And we have been a benign state. We have been an innocent state. Under our nose, all this happened. Right through the 80s, right through the 90s, it kept happening. For example, I don't want to bring in Kashmir so early in this discussion, but look at Kashmir. Sufi Islam of Kashmir, virtually over the last 20 years, changed. 800, 900 mosques were taken over. The use of finance and financial power, the use of different elements of the clergy from different parts of India who were brought in, who changed the entire discourse there. And you don't even find a Kashmiri Sufi scholar or a Kashmiri Sufi cleric in Kashmir today. And we had no realization. So this interesting question which you asked me, do we have a counter-narrative? Do we have an understanding in India? I'm sorry, for many, many years, we have never had that understanding. And someone I remember, 1 minute more for me, someone asked me once, General, you are a Muslim. Do you think you could explain this whole issue to the Indian army by writing on it, by creating a presentation for it? So I took it upon myself and I researched. I researched extensively. I empowered myself. And today I go all around the army explaining to people the whole context of violent extremism. Not only dealing with Islam, but we're dealing with different other faiths, different ideologies. For example, Naxalism. Naxalism itself is a violent, it has a philosophy of violent extremism. The creation of a communist state in India 2046 through the use of violence is nothing but violent extremism. How do you counter it? How do you have the counter-narratives for it? That is something for us to discuss.
All right. Some very interesting points made there. And one of the things that we have here, which is, as I said, which is quite rare, is that we've got a very distinguished representation from South Asia, right? So one thing I'm going to do as we move ahead is that now you all are allowed to question each other as well. So let's see how the neighborhood thing really works. When we're talking about, let's go to Maldives for a second before I move ahead. You know, as I mentioned before, we've read that per capita, Maldives has sent the most number of fighters to the so-called Islamic State, or to Syria in general, to fight for the cause, so to speak. What we lack in understanding in this example, of course, the numbers are striking, right? So we understand the numbers. But what has taken place in a small island nation like Maldives, where such numbers have come up, that they, and it's not just about radicalization, it's about radicalization and then moving towards, you know, taking the travel to Syria and having that belief that they need to join the caliphate. When did this turn take place in Maldivian history? And was it coming for a long time? Since you were in the police, did you see this sort of taking place, or was it? I don't want to say sudden, but it took place in a short period of time because of some other factors.
Well, Islamic radicalism started taking place in the Maldives in the early 90s, when we had Maldivians who had, at that period of time, traveled to places in the Middle East to seek Islamic knowledge and returning back to the country. And at that time, we did not have a democracy. We had a government that was very much suppressing whatever, I mean, there wasn't this space for free speech. So these clerics or scholars, what they started doing was to spread the ideology, their narratives, their messaging associated with Salafism and Wahhabism. Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, people who had been to these countries, who had come during that time. And this has been going up until around, let's say, early 2000s. So 2003 was the period where there was an incident which actually led to the start of a democracy movement, advocacy for democracy which began. And there was huge pressure on the then government to kickstart a reform agenda. And that I mean, created space for the people who have been propagating secretly their version of or their ideology about Islam. And I think during 2007, Maldives first had its very first violent act, which is associated to Islam. The 2007 September 29 nail bomb attack, which took place in one of the tourist attractions, just a handful of tourist attractions we have in the capital city of Maldives, which is just 5 kilometers in size, which is an attraction for Western tourists. It's a Sultan Park, which injured some 12 tourists. Most of them were British nationals. And I think that was the eye-opening act or incident which actually forced the state, the government, the then government, to actually have some kind of focus on this. And then we had the 2008 where we embraced a new constitution, which is more akin to democracy. We embraced the system of governance, I mean democracy as a system of government. And from there we again went on to have political pluralism, where we also had the very first Islamist political party. So there is a lot of politics involved in what I can, or what some of my colleagues call Islamic radicalization, whether it to be as instrumentalization of Islam by political parties, by politicians, for their own gain, for their political gain. So I think that's a rough timeline of how this has happened. It did not just happen suddenly. It has been growing right under our nose. I think a lack of concerted effort, a lack of state machinery to actually counter this movement, these acts or this kind of propagating of extremist narrative, I think has led to the point where we are now alleged or said to have sent the most number of foreign terrorist fighters per capita wise.
Just a quick question before I move to Mr. Perera. You mentioned the role that some political parties are playing in such outcomes. And you may not want to answer this, or you can choose not to, but I would really like if you do. But do these political parties have direct affiliations or support from either foreign parties or foreign governments that you think is problematic? Since you're saying that a lot of people have traveled to the Middle East and they get teachings from there and they come back and they propagate those teachings. Do you think there is a systematic manner in which this is being done, or is it just a sporadic happening?
There is claim by local as well as foreign observers that a lot of funding comes from abroad, which I don't think it's fair to point fingers at individual countries. But I think, the general suspicion is that there is foreign funding that comes to promote this extremist ideology, and there are locally based NGOs. NGOs operating under the guise of promoting Islam or promoting the practice of Islam, but working in a more organized fashion to promote the extremist narrative. Right. So I think there is a lack of understanding. And again, when we talk about the state machinery, the security apparatus, which again is a very sad state for not having been very effectual over the past years. And I think the public trust and confidence, there's a huge deficit in the public trust and confidence in the security apparatus, which is again not very helpful to our situation. So when we look at political parties, yes, political parties, whether it is the ruling political party or the ruling political party alliance or the opposition, each is actually forced to be on the side, taking sides with what we can call is Islamist parties or Islamist groups. And right now what we are seeing is there is a lot of hate that is spread on the mediums like social media. I think there is one statistic which is, I mean, anything about Maldives per capita wise is going to be big when we compare to other South Asian countries. Maldives has 44% of its population has some presence on social media, whereas Sri Lanka has 7% of its population on social media and 9%. I think in terms of India's presence on social media. So that again actually makes the Maldivian population very vulnerable to the spread of extremist messaging, narrative on mediums such as social media. So right now what we are seeing is there are people openly spreading hateful messages. We have seen recently, 2012, October 2nd, we had one of our very renowned moderate scholar who was murdered at his home, also happened to be a member of parliament. It was right, I mean, just 3-4 months after the ouster of the then government in 2012. Then we had the 2004 forced disappearance of a journalist who goes by the name of Rilwan Abdullah, whose, I mean, case the police actually, I don't know what they did with the investigation. We still don't know what actually happened with it. And who's, I mean, the only suspects related to that case are freely roaming on the streets of the capital. And then the most recent one was the April 23rd murder of a very liberal blogger who goes by the name Rashid. So these incidences actually are indicative of how much hate is being spread in the Maldives.
Right. Some very interesting points there. I'll just change the direction a little bit, moving to Mr. Perera at the far end. Something that General Hasnain said, that the whole concept of violent extremism it's very easy to get stuck in a quagmire which is Islamist based, right? But you mentioned the Naxalites, for example, which is on the other end of political ideology at least, but the end to the means is similar. Mr. Perera, in Sri Lanka, in some time ago we read, or it came in the news at least, that extremist Buddhist groups were fairly active in Sri Lanka, and specifically when the whole issue of the Rohingya crisis was taking place in Myanmar. And from at least personally, I do not know much about how Sri Lanka is taking care of that, or how big an issue that is fermenting to become. Can you just shed some light on that aspect of it?
Yeah, the association of Buddhism with politics and with the kingship is there right from Sri Lanka's historical beginnings. In our ancient scriptures, it is said that the Buddhist monks accompanied the armies of the kings because the kings were protecting Buddhism. They were protecting the Sinhala, the ethnic majority, the race, and Buddhism. So there is a validation of the role of the Buddhist religion in protecting the Sinhala and the island. Then during the colonial period, there was the feeling among the Buddhists that the colonial rulers, the British, were favoring the ethnic minorities, favoring the Tamils. So there was a sense of grievance there, historical grievance, which emerged after Sri Lanka got independence. And then the time came and political power was transferred into the hands of the Buddhist majority, because Buddhists are 70% of the Sri Lankan population. And then came the time to correct historical wrongs, historical grievances, which is where the discrimination began against the Tamils, because it was felt that the Tamils had benefited the most under the British. At this time, there is a sense among the Buddhists that in the aftermath of the war, where Tamil nationalism and the Tamil separatist movement has been suppressed, that the threat now comes from Islam, from the Muslim population. And that is due to a sense that the Muslim population is growing more rapidly than the Sinhala population. And the Muslim population is connected to global Islam. And therefore, there is now a sense that actually the Sinhalese population is threatened. And this is very widespread, and the propaganda is taking place on the social media. And in the social media, it is pointed out that in the past, that countries such as Afghanistan, Pakistan, Indonesia were not Muslim. They were Hindu or Buddhist. And today they are Muslim. And a similar fate could befall Sri Lanka, the Sinhalese in Sri Lanka. Right. So this is what is justifying, giving justification to, again, extremism growing among the Buddhist population. But it is also being exploited by the political parties. Unfortunately, Buddhist nationalism has been always used by political parties to get votes. And so now we have the party in the opposition playing on these fears of the Buddhists. Although the war is over, they say the threat remains. There is a threat from global Islam. There's a threat from the West. There's a threat from the Tamil diaspora. And therefore, the Buddhists have to remain strong.
Right. General Rashid, one of the fallouts of this debate was the Rohingya crisis that Bangladesh is bearing the brunt of at the moment, at least. How do you see this? How does Bangladesh tackle this situation right now? I mean, there's been a global condemnation on what Myanmar has done, but there has also been reluctance, for example, from India's side, to put any real pressure on Myanmar, right? Despite a lot of statements that have come out in the recent past, saying that Myanmar is going to take back the Rohingyas. How is Bangladesh seeing this playing out at the moment?
Thank you for the question. That religion or faith aspects are already explained by Mr. Perera. So what I say that tolerance between the religion, it has to be maintained at any cost. Bangladesh is trying to do that. Bangladesh also having a Buddhist population across the border, and thereby also there are many other tribal societies or ethnic communities which have actually come across the borders as well, if we see the ethnological history. So we are not actually going into that. We are looking for a peaceful solution. And if I connect, if I read Barrett, I guess, she was sitting on my chair and she told that if there are some problem like violent extremism, if the specific country fails to act or react because of its own inherent weakness, it is the global community or their country is going to come and interfere. So that is a great concern of the geostrategic equation as we are talking about South Asian security. So we see this Rohingya problem in two contexts. One is Bangladesh context, another is a South Asian context. So in Bangladesh context, it is true, more than 1 million people are now in Bangladesh, which Bangladesh need to tackle. So Bangladesh has given a space, and for which the Bangladesh Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina has been termed as a mother of the humanity. But question is that this is a global problem. The population, these population, Rohingyas, they are known as the stateless and most persecuted elements of global population. So it is a global responsibility. That's what the people of Bangladesh think so. So automatically Bangladesh wanted to have all of his friends together, that to put a pressure, because we are all friends, and ultimately to put a pressure on Myanmar to take them back and give them a swift and a safe solution. repatriation. Now question is that swift solution, somebody puts doubt that whether it is going to give a safe solution or not. So we are looking for both. I'm sure to do that, the international community need to act or react very promptly. And we are now at this moment, what happens, as the people of Bangladesh and India had been cooperating since 1971, and there are a lot of what is called emotional attachment, as well as we have a shared history, culture and everything. So they have a extra demand to the Indian people that look at my problem, India must stand by my side. So whatever may be the case, that doesn't matter. In South Asia, the security problem which Bangladesh sees, that any problem in the continental South Asia, means India, Bangladesh, these are all attached to a single geographic mass. Though it is a different country, but if you see the map, you know, these are single geographic mass. So anywhere there is a problem, so automatically any extra regional force presence in this area certainly would hamper or would create a new kind of threat as a whole to the South Asian security. Because there is also an Indian Ocean game, most of you know, so we don't like to explain that and waste time. So that South Indian Ocean scheme and this, if we relate together, the Bangladesh actually acting very maturely and wanted a what is called peaceful solution. And so Bangladesh is trying to contain this problem. And this 1 million plus Rohingya population in Bangladesh territory actually is not only on Bangladesh territory. It is on a single geographic mass of South Asia, the largest mass of the South Asia. So the threat which originates from this stateless persecuted people actually is going to affect the whole South Asia as a whole, including China. So automatically, so Bangladesh is trying to containing this threat, for which still no other country is feeling the pinch of it. So what I mean to say, that if the Bangladesh leaves its containment policy, automatically the threat would be multi-directional, and that would affect the other country. So we must understand and analyze what is the real threat of the coming out from the Rohingya stateless population. Right. And accordingly, we have to have a joint solution to solve this problem as soon as possible. Otherwise, you know, there will be a terrorism problem, there will be a problem for gun running, there will be a problem for human trafficking. Already there are a few reports we have seen in the BBC and others. So that is the approach at this moment Bangladesh is taking, looking for a peaceful solution, and all international community, including the SAARC countries, must stand by the Rohingya people as well as Bangladesh to bring it to a peaceful solution.
I'll just move quickly to General Hasnain now. So we've heard everything from Islamism to Naxalism to you know, radical Buddhism and everything. Now the question that comes into play here is, as we started with the whole terminology of South Asia being a tinderbox, right? And as General Rashid just said, there has to be some semblance within South Asia to fight against all these things. Now, we've seen the diversity here of the issues. Is it even possible to have semblance within South Asia, within the states represented on this stage at least, to fight against extremism as a single entity, or it is by nature and by definition a very hyper-local issue that needs hyper-local solutions?
Thank you, that's an outstanding question. My immediate response from top of the head is as a combination of the two. Because I've worked in Sri Lanka, 2.5 years with the IPKF, so I know a lot about Sri Lanka. I've been to Bangladesh a couple of times. I studied Bangladesh a lot, very fascinated by the Bangladesh model, the success that Bangladesh has achieved in its counter-radicalization, counter-violent extremism practices. At the same time, I think we have models all over South Asia. The only unfortunate thing is that we don't perhaps have sufficient platforms, institutions, the unfortunate absence of SAARC as a very effective tool. One of the aspects of SAARC, counterterrorism within SAARC, is virtually non-existent. So to that extent, I think that we do suffer from a certain handicap. But having said that, I'm sure the police forces of the various countries, bilaterally, trilaterally, the armies now have started doing a lot of cooperation together. The India and Bangladesh are doing a lot of cooperation. India and Sri Lanka are doing a lot of cooperation together. I hope that instead of just looking at some aspect of staff exercises and things like that, we start actually looking at best practices. And that is the way to look forward. Even if you don't identify extremely good best practices from within the subcontinent, you can find best practices from other parts of the world and possibly experiment with them. Although I would dare say that within India, we've had some great best practices. Look at the Punjab model. Didn't we resolve Punjab to a very great extent? Not to say that, of course, Pakistan pulled back a lot from Punjab, which allowed us to do it. But notwithstanding that, we achieved a tremendous amount in Punjab. I dare say in Kashmir, we have had model after model. It's been a dynamic process for the last 28 years. We've succeeded and we've failed many times. I think we need to learn our lessons from there. We need to share much more of that laterally between the countries in the subcontinent. And looming problems like the Rohingya problem, which is right in front of us, I think we need not be in denial of it. We need to understand that that problem is there, and there's a tremendous amount of cooperation required between the countries of South Asia to overcome a problem of that nature.
Right, great. So we've got 10 minutes and we can open it to the floor for questions. Please keep your questions pointed and short. Do not try to disguise them as speeches. I will call you out if that happens. Britta, we can start with you. And at the back, sir, can you come to the mic?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
I'm Britta Peterson. I work with the Observer Research Foundation. I have a question to General Hasnain. You mentioned that in Kashmir, 800 Sufi shrines or mosques have been taken over by radicals. And my question is because during the time when I was working in Pakistan for 4 years, we had been working a lot with Sufis. And you know that as a result of the strength of Sufis, almost all the Sufi shrines in Pakistan have been also attacked. Although it is not to that point that they are really taken over by extremists, but it's obviously a very strong force that, for religious reasons, extremists don't like the Sufi ideology. My question is to you, actually, how did this happen in Kashmir? And do you think that if Sufis would have more support from the Indian state, this would be a positive force in the sense of best practice?
Thank you. That's a very good question, once again. I like to explain these kind of things anecdotally. Let me just take you to Kashmir, and those my friends from Kashmir who are here. There's a very famous madrasa, which is on the way from Baramulla to Uri. It's a place called Shiri, and you would have probably seen it, many of you. Now, when I was the commander of the Baramulla division, I remember asking someone within my command, has anyone ever visited this madrasa? No one had. I said, don't you think we are duty-bound to go there and have a look as to what's this all about? Everyone was quiet. No one wanted to touch a madrasa with a barge pole because they had no idea what's inside. And there, the common narrative was it's a very dangerous place. If you land up there, unexplained, something very awful may happen, and you may not be in control of it. So I decided upon myself I must get there. I went in there, you know how I went in there. I went in carrying baskets of fruit, lots of sweets, lots of sports items. And I requested the local clergy, why can't we distribute all this? So he said, okay. So we all had a nice party. And then I started asking him. I said, what is the curriculum here? And from the curriculum, I could make out that this was the most unhappy institution anywhere. Because from 4 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock at night, all they were doing was they were into prayers and into religion, right? Where is the concept of happiness? What about the youth, young people? How are they involved in all this? So I said, two things. I said, why don't you join the local district sports tournament? And I will train your team. Even if you lose, doesn't matter. We got them to do that. And the second thing, we got them to take part in the Republic Day March Past in Baramulla. And they came, they took part in the March Past, they saluted the national flag, which they had never seen in their life, inside the madrasa. And so a sense of patriotism came into them. Why I'm trying to relate to this to you? We are so scared of these things, most of us. It was left to me because I knew culture, I knew the faith. I was not afraid of doing this at all. But usually, a complete lack of knowledge. In today's world, just remember, it's not conventional warfare. Warfare today is all hybrid. It's all about cultures. It's all about minds, how to get people over. In Kashmir, over 20, 25 years, the minds of people have been changed. Right? I always said in Kashmir, I have two centers of gravity. One is the gun, and the other is the mind. The gun I can get rid of. No problem. I'll eliminate the gun with the use of counter-violence. How do I get rid of the idea? The idea of azadi. That I can get azadi through the use of religion. That is the problem. And most of us never look at that aspect. We don't understand the aspects of ideologies, counter-ideologies, counter-narratives. If there is such a strong narrative that azadi or independence of Kashmir can be achieved through the use of violence, have we ever tried to bring about a counter-narrative to upset that ideology, neutralize that ideology, that is not an achievable, aim. We have only done it through the use of violence. But if you do it through the use of ideas, that will change things. Great. I hope I've answered your question to an extent.
Sir, at the back. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Closer to the mic, please.
Can you hear me, sir?
Yeah.
Okay, my question is in the South Asian context. We are talking of tackling insurgent ideologies or countering violent extremism. How about the extremism or the violence which is perpetuated by the state? For example, what happened in Myanmar? For example, what is happening on the Western Front in Waziristan or with the Pashtuns, where the state is using the state instruments of state to perpetuate violence on its own citizen. That's also an ideology which needs to be countered.
Is there anyone else who wants to ask the question? Because we're running short of time. If not, we can keep this as the last one. No one? Anyone care to take that? General Rashid, Mr. Perera, the use of violence by the state, and not necessarily by insurgencies, but by state. How does that affect?
Certainly, I'd like to address this one. This is a very nice question. The state, we call it state actors. The state actors, in short, that any state who is supporting or promoting either ideologies or supplying weapons or supporting, giving monies. So this patronization is very widely seen. And if we take a statement of the recent statement of the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohamed bin Salman, he has narrated that how his country was utilized to export the Wahhabi ideologies to the Muslim country to make to turn Islam into a violent Islam. So after that, whatever we had the idea, we had to reshape those, and this is very important about supporting this sort of activities by the state. Now actually to keep the state in control, we have the supra-state structure in the world. So what is the activities and what is the effectiveness of those supra-state institutions are now coming into questions. And actually innocent citizens of the country who have become the victim of those illegal actions by the state actors must be taken into account. That world now must think about that line, because now we have to create or recreate the supranational structure so that a state can be within the bound. And what happens now in this moment, what we see, anytime, any locally, I'm sure that as Perera has mentioned that his country could get rid of the insurgency, but now facing the problem of accountability. That means war crime charges. Now the military and the police officers, many of the individual police officers have been listed that they have done either any crime, war crime, in the process of discharging their official duties. So that became a problem of the, particularly those who are serving security forces element. So that is also becoming a big threat to the growing state or the developing state to act unilaterally, and any actions by the state now is supposed to have the global support. And every time you do not secure the global support as you wish, so that is becoming a problem to countering the ideologies as well as countering the violent extremism by the particular country. That's a reality, and that's why I think General Hasnain will accept that generals' hands have been tied to fight a insurgency war. So that is the problem that we have now come across. Thank you.
General Hassan, I think you have something to say there. Yeah? Yeah, go ahead. We've got 2 minutes.
My only response to that very good question would be that as soon as the state gets involved in countering violent extremism or probably executing violent extremism itself, it gets mired into geopolitics. And that becomes the problem. As long as it's within the state. You see, for example, if it's in Kashmir or if it's in Sri Lanka, it's not such a major issue. For example, in Pakistan, as the example is we are talking about, it becomes slightly transnational, starts looking into Afghanistan, is related to issues connected with Afghanistan, etc. Then it gets mired into geopolitics. And then finding solutions to that becomes a major problem. The United Nations as an institution so far, my personal opinion, on issues of hybrid war, on issues of violent extremism, has really played a very low-key role. And its capability to play a role larger than what it has played is still suspect. So I think largely we are at a juncture where this is in a drift, in a state of drift. And you will find that there may be violent counter-actions being taking place in Pakistan. For example, the use of heavy weapons could be going on in the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa area and things like that. But the world is not willing to look at that because it's got certain interests in that. Pakistan is a very, very important country geostrategically. 5 civilizations border it, all around it. Everyone has got interest in that strategic space. Who would therefore want to get involved with condemnation of Pakistan and then going ahead and doing something about it? Condemning is one thing, but doing something about it is another thing. So I think we are at a juncture where we really are mired in a status of no options. Really no options.
Yeah, last point, Mr. Perera. We're out of time.
The danger of the state, when the state starts using violence, the danger is that of impunity. If there is impunity and where human rights violations take place, war crimes take place, then you create a fertile ground among the people for further rebellion. So I think that state must, when it has to use, state violence is the last resort. And when the state has to use violence, it should do it within the rule of law. The rule of law is extremely important. So we need to have strong institutions. And the army must always, the military must always act under the civilian authority.
Right. I think this panel can spend easily another hour discussing, just scratching the surface what we have discussed today, but we are out of time. But please join me in thanking the panelists, all 4 of them, for a very fruitful discussion. And thank you all for joining us today.